Um, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome everyone to the newest lecture in a series that has been organized by the Asian Studies Unit at the King Faisal Center. And this series focuses on inviting scholars as well as professionals to come and share with us their knowledge on matters related to China and East Asia writ large on a variety of different topics and issues. Today, we're very much honored to have with us Sean Ding to talk with us about technology and sort of Sino-American competition in the technological arena. I'll give you a brief bio of Mr. Ding. He's a managing partner at Plenum, which is a Beijing-based independent research company that provides in-depth data and analysis on Chinese politics, economy, and financial markets to institutional investors and multinational firms. Sean oversees the company's business strategy and frequently advises senior executives and asset managers on Chinese politics and US-China relations. Before co-founding Plenum, Sean worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and served as a senior associate at the Carter Center's China program. Sean holds a bachelor's degree in Arabic and foreign service from Beijing Foreign Studies University and an MBA from Emory University. I also believe he advised President Carter on his multiple visits to China and sort of providing or paving the way for his engagement with official circles there. Of course, the style that we adopt for these types of lectures is not really a formal lecture style, but rather a conversational style. I'll be posing a series of questions to Mr. Ding over the course of 45 minutes. And after that back and forth, we will open space for attendees to pose their questions to him directly. I encourage everyone to ask their questions through the Q&A box located below. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ding and also pose the first key question for him. We can start with his opening remarks, which is what have been some of the key developments in China's thinking on technology policy over the past few decades? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that very kind introduction. I think you said it way better than I could myself. And it's a great pleasure to be at the King Faisal Center. I'm looking very much to a conversation with all of you today. I guess before I answer the first question, just a little bit more on what I've been doing in the past few years and sort of the vantage points that I think might benefit the way we understand some of these questions today. We worked with, when I was working for President Carter, we worked with a lot of local officials in China, worked with ministerial level, sort of departmental and sectional level officials, and trying to basically, form joint projects with them. And throughout that process, we sort of started to get this new understanding of how China really works. There is a saying in China that it's the section chiefs who are running the country, right? It's not your ministers, it's not the state leaders even, it's the section chiefs who are actually writing up the policy documents for the approval of their superiors, like many governments. And later, when I left the public sector and started to start my own company, we worked with a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs, many in the technology space, helping them expand to overseas markets. And we got another understanding of how, different Chinese private sector businesses are thinking about international relations. You would assume that they have if they're already expanding overseas, they would have a holistic understanding of what's happening, let's say in the US, what's happening in the Middle East. But the fact is, the understanding is really quite limited. And again, it's not the chairmen of the board, it's not the CEOs in Shanghai or Beijing who are really driving the agenda. It's sometimes a lot of the manager level, the section chief level people that are really formulating a lot of their opinions and agendas. So in that light, the first question, how has basically China's thinking toward technology and innovation has evolved really has a lot to do with the people who 5, 6, even 10 years ago, that are making these policies, that are sort of presenting different options to the Chinese leadership. And let me just share a very quick slide here with all of you so that we can go over some of these policy developments that I think are quite important. When China, to me, had an early start in realizing the risks of internet. I think the world has now come together, especially the US and Europe, with the European passage of GDPR, with the US drive toward sort of securing the cyberspace. You have a lot more controversy and discussion about, what does it mean to have a free flow information? What does it mean to have a global internet? China, maybe by accident, came to this conclusion early. Back in 2009, they blocked Facebook. They drove out Google a year later in 2010. And in 2014, just 2 years after President Xi Jinping took power, he formed a central leading group for cybersecurity and informatization. And this group later became the Central Cyberspace Affairs Commission, the CAC. So this view of course, out of self-defense, out of regime stability, internet should have borders, should have boundaries, right? Should have sovereignty. This view has been entrenched in Chinese leaders, especially the local official, the ministerial officials, thinking about how to govern the cyberspace, how to govern technology. So this is one aspect that I wanted to sort of throw out as a preface, or as a baseline in terms of how China's thinking started, right? They tie everything with sovereignty, with the notion of borders and boundaries, right? The technology that needs to be Chinese, the policies that need to be Chinese, and the data, the internet governance models that are within the Chinese sovereign borders. So that's sort of a foundation of Beijing's thinking toward technology. Now, moving on to the sort of the policy space, what you're seeing today in terms of, like, if you look at the headlines, the US is criticizing China for trying to export censorship, right? Trying to export its own technological models, or the companies, the state-led champions. This hasn't always been the case. So back in 2015, when China as a country started to realize that, okay, we cannot depend on cheap labor, depend on manufacturing for the next decades to come, right? Because cost of labor is rising. Countries in Southeast Asia, in Africa, many of these countries are taking away a little bit of the manufacturing jobs that China has been depending on in the past. So the thinking back then was to leverage advanced manufacturing, advanced manufacturing sector to make it become the new pillar of Chinese economy. Of course, nobody talks about Made in China 2025 these days, because it was the culprit of a lot of the criticism toward China. But as a policy document, it is still quite important. It reflects China's thinking back then. They were relying very heavily on sort of the next stage of manufacturing. There wasn't a whole lot of thinking around, so how do we leverage data? How do we leverage AI? How do we leverage China's new internet companies to lead the development? And think about it, that's only a little bit over 5 years ago. So it's not really a long time that China's thinking started to shift. A year later, in 2016, when Beijing unveiled the 13th five-year plan, which is a industry plan that's being formulated every basically 5 years, and then plan out for the next 5. So there was a shift from manufacturing toward Internet Plus. Again, this is rather interesting, because 2015, 2016 is when you started to see a lot of Chinese internet companies started to take flight. If you recall the bike sharing craze during those few years, the Chinese foreign spokesperson in the government actually labeled sort of bike sharing as one of China's new 4 great inventions, right? And what they didn't realize back then was that there was a lot of bubble, there was a lot of capital and basically money-driven craze behind that phenomenon. Is not really sort of high-tech innovation. It's just an application of internet technology in daily use. But that phenomenon did remind the policymakers that, oh wow, this is something that can really unlock new growth opportunities. So back in 2016, the thinking shifted toward Internet of Things, Internet Plus, big data, and cybersecurity. And a year later, the thinking evolved again. China developed a plan for the new generation of artificial intelligence. This is shortly after the US, the Obama plan for AI in the US, which was announced, I believe, October of 2016. So shortly after the US plan, which really didn't go anywhere because the US has such a private sector driven approach, unlike China. So the Chinese plan for artificial intelligence has a very strong focus on defense, on national defense and on national security. Again, going back to this overall thinking, the backdrop of internet sovereignty and cybersecurity that Xi Jinping himself values a great extent. And finally, fast forward to this year, after COVID, China has again upgraded or updated its thinking toward what should be really the driver of the Chinese economy for the decades to come. It published a guideline on improving the so-called market-based allocation mechanism of production factors. This is a very sort of a macroeconomic jargon almost, right? In terms of production factors, that really are talking about the drivers of the economy, the fundamental drivers of the economy. Now, in addition to land, labor, and capital, which basically is common across all countries, no matter where you are, China has highlighted technology and data. So if you look at this whole evolution of policy documents, likely drafted by section chiefs and then of course endorsed and approved by the state leaders, it showed two sort of trends. One is that the policy making has shifted to a great extent from the State Council to Xi Jinping himself. So back in 2015, 3 years after Xi took power, Made in China 2025, if you recall, was still driven largely by Premier Li Keqiang, by the State Council. He was the sort of the face, the champion of China's industry policy just 5 years ago. In 2020, when we talk about production factor, when we talk about the use of technology, data, AI to drive the economy, it was all Xi Jinping. It was all the General Secretary and the President of China, Xi. And the Premier has sort of taken a more implementation or execution role in this policy making process. One example is right after COVID, the first stop of Xi's visit outside of Beijing was actually Hangzhou City in Zhejiang province, where he visited the City Brain project. This is a sort of a public-private partnership that leverages on the hundreds of thousands of cameras and facial recognition devices in the city to map out basically an entire management system for the city. And then he was championing the use of data, the use of AI, use of big data in basically local governance. So that and the production factors reform document basically came out, back to back. So that's the first trend. The second trend is, how China's thinking has really evolved from, market-driven or from company-driven sort of conclusions, right? By looking at internet companies, they decided that Internet Plus was going to be a new driver, right? To what I see as a much more fundamental and high-level understanding of what would drive the Chinese economy, which is technology and data. And this emphasis is something that I think a lot of developing countries, even for US and European countries, are still trying to grapple, right? How much can technology and data really drive the economy? Now that takes us to what's going to happen next month during the 14th five-year plan. At Platinum, our research company, all we do is trying to look at the crystal ball and tell the future. So for the 14th five-year plan, which will be unveiled this October, we think that they will again put a lot of emphasis on technology and data, especially they will emphasize the role of state-owned companies, of the state-owned sector in terms of driving the advancement of technology and data. So you're not going to see the same kind of craze in terms of private capital building up a bubble, driving up valuation for companies to go public in NASDAQ, like what you've seen in the shared bicycle episode of China's technology development, but rather you're going to see a lot of state-led effort in trying to develop China's edge, trying to bridge the gaps in semiconductors, in AI, in chip design. So I think that's sort of an overview of the evolution of Chinese technology policy.
Yeah, that's very comprehensive. I mean, what I'm thinking of when I'm listening to you is also how a lot of this intersects with the party's own concerns about its durability and long-term security. Because on the one hand, you have a story where the party has always seen the internet as well as other broader technologies as sources of potential threats because of the democratization of information sharing. So I remember reading about, for example, Clinton's phrase about the inability of China to control the internet. It's like pinning or nailing Jello to a wall. And that seems to be one current, because Jello can never stick if you nail it into a wall. So it seems like that's part of their thinking in terms of how to manage technology in different ways. So when you think about, for example, the internet kill switches that have been implemented in the system and which were used in certain provinces. But also on the other hand, there is sort of this thinking on the part of the elite in the party, like for example, Wang Huning, the idea that there needs to be a state-led change of the economy in order for China to escape from being trapped in a middle income situation and to actually transform into a great power. And technology is seen as sort of a salvational force in that story. So it's interesting that, to me, the story is very ideological and not just sort of technical and economic, I guess. I don't know if you agree with it.
No, completely. I think that's a great addition to this sort of evolution of thinking. I guess the reason why I didn't mention the ideological part is because I think it's always there. It's sort of like the assumption of a lot of these decisions. It's regime stability, party legitimacy, and this whole view, like almost worldview of what the internet can do, is always sort of the backdrop of a lot of these different policies. But from an industry perspective, I think there is still it's still quite important to note that the lack of innovation or the different sort of rounds of tech bubbles and all the employment concerns, even at the lower levels. If you look at the China's delivery business model, right? You have, I think this has been in the Chinese media headlines, at least for the past couple of weeks. There were quite a few articles talking about just how miserable the delivery guys are in China. They're being pretty much suppressed by algorithm, right? They have very tight deadlines to meet. For example, if they go up an elevator in the building, they were given an extra 6 minutes, no more, no less. If they go beyond that limit, they are going to get punished. So I think in addition to the ideological perspective, there is also the social welfare and employment and stability factor, right? How much can China really still depend on this kind of low-level innovation and like the jobs that are created by these internet plus companies, and the need to really upgrade a lot of these people into something that's more sustainable. So I think the economic component and the industry component is still quite important. But I of course agree, the ideological driving force is probably still a fundamental philosophy that the Chinese policymakers have in the back of their mind.
All of these are organically interconnected. The whole question of how do you weigh when, stability maintenance and all that ideology with economy. Maybe we can jump to the next question, which is, what does this history of sort of the evolution of technology policy mean for Sino-American relations? If you have any thoughts on that, and then maybe sort of in connection to it, what implications does it have for actors beyond Beijing and Washington?
Sure, and that's a great question. I think in terms of the implication for China-US relations, it's again this sort of shift in paradigm, right? Before, China came to the realization early that internet can be dangerous. That's why they shut out Google, Facebook, and Instagram and everything else. But technology, on the other hand, is also quite path dependent. What I mean by that is that, maybe sometimes you don't even have to have a clear view of what a country wants in terms of its influence in the technology sphere globally. The companies, the tools that they use, the platforms they use would shape the path, would shape the eventual form of how a different technological ecosystem is developed. For example, China is now championing this idea of global data security initiative. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, after his tour in Europe, came back to China and came up with this idea of a global data security initiative. If you look at what it's advocating for, it's quite sovereign-centric. And this approach, which puts data at the core and puts a sovereign lens on top of data, is fundamentally different from what the US is advocating for. The US has always advocated for free flow, sort of borderless flow of data. And the reason of that division is, again, because of the different economic models. For the US internet, it's driven by private sector. It's driven by companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon. In order for these companies to be successful globally and for them to even become globally dominant, there needs to be free flow of data. There cannot be sort of different sovereign boundaries where you have to conform and comply with different kinds of regulations, because that would basically mean an end to American companies' ability to expand globally. One analogy I sometimes use is when cars or automobiles were invented, you started to see this pretty much, globalization of auto standards in terms of, the design, in terms of how cars are, the safety features that it should have. Of course, you have different, European American standards for safety is different, but fundamentally, it's something that's easy to tweak. But if you're talking about technology, essentially you're talking about cars that have to have 4 wheels or 5 wheels, or does it have to look a certain way? And that's going to really hinder private sector companies' ability to expand overseas. But for China, the game is very different. For China, what they're thinking is that we have these companies that grew out of the Chinese soil, the Chinese environment of internet. They became successful. For example, TikTok, which is in the news these days, and Alibaba, they grew from the Chinese internet environment. They leveraged the data that's shared by Chinese internet users. So these data and these models should inherently be Chinese. So in this case, I think what does it really mean for long-term China-US relationship, especially in the technology front, is this divergence that's really hard to bridge, because essentially what it's going to take is either, it's almost, I hate the word Cold War, but I think in the technology front, it is really some kind of Cold War happening, because you see Cold War, the reason why I think a lot of think tank scholars really hate the term sort of China-US new Cold War is because the ideological component is not that strong, right, as compared to the US-Soviet competition. You still have a lot of interdependence, economic interdependence between China and the US. But in the technology space, it's really hard sort of not to argue that there is no Cold War, because it's fundamentally two ideologies, right? One is pro-global free flow internet. The other is very sovereign centric. And there really is no interdependence. There is no sort of linkages that's so strong that would prevent a so-called tech decoupling. One may argue that in Silicon Valley, you have a lot of Chinese investment, at least up until recently. And then China has always been borrowing a lot of the new ideas, the talent at the private level. You have a lot of companies still collaborating. But I would say those linkages are not really strong enough, and they're very fragile. If you just look at what Facebook has been doing in terms of lobbying the Trump administration for blocking TikTok, right? They spent really, millions and millions of dollars trying to prevent TikTok from being able to compete with Facebook in the U.S. market or even globally. So you can say that some of the early Chinese internet companies were sort of copycatting Silicon Valley models and make them successful in China, but in my view, that's no longer the case. You have really indigenous innovation. You have the data that's already accumulated in China that in itself, it's wealth. It's in AI, all you need is the quality and quantity and diversity of data. And China has a very clear lead in that compared to the US. So Silicon Valley is feeling the threat more now than before from China. So the linkages that were the commercial linkages and the talent linkages that would prevent some kind of technological Cold War, I think, is actually quite weak these days. And on top of that, you have, again, like we discussed earlier, Mohammed, in terms of everything being really, interconnected, you have the Chinese state-driven economic development model, and this whole policy trajectory that we saw earlier. I think, back in 2016, 17, you could still argue that the Chinese technology space, the internet space, was driven largely by private companies like Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. But I think with this whole, WeChat and the ByteDance or TikTok saga, Beijing has realized that there is this inherent vulnerability to a private sector-led approach to technology, because they are easily subject to foreign regulatory measures or foreign sanctions. And because they're driven by the need to make money for their shareholders, they do not really have a strong foothold or strong political stance. And again, going back to the political front, if you saw what the party came up with in terms of the United Front work document, trying to unite the private sector companies, right? This is a policy document that came up a couple of weeks ago that really discussed the need to bring China's private entrepreneurs back into the fold. The number one priority is to have a clear mind in politics. This is sort of an awkward translation of the Chinese text, but the idea is that they're calling for private companies to have a clear sense of political loyalty, right? Where their technology should have a nationality, right? And if you look at this TikTok case, again, China has felt this almost embarrassment or lose of face. And this is really the biggest thing that the Chinese leadership have been worried about. They don't want to lose face, right? They're feeling that they're losing face by allowing ByteDance to sell TikTok in the first place to Microsoft, right? So that's why they came up with, of course, the export control list that would limit the export of algorithms of Chinese technology to another country. So to come back to the sort of the China-US relations, I think this is the sort of the tech Cold War that's really hard to bridge, I think, in the short term. And what does this mean for other countries is that I think since we're talking, with the King Faisal Center, I think at least for regions like the Gulf or the Middle East, in terms of technology infrastructure, this region has already been quite dependent on Chinese technology, especially with the push of Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese device makers, consumer device makers in the region. And that also coupled with China's Android innovation. The developing world, and also including the Middle East, has a large penetration of Android devices. And for China, because Apple iOS is a closed ecosystem, but there are actually quite a number of Chinese global Android developers that are creating all these apps and all these operating systems and devices. So these taken together, going back to my earlier point of path dependence, what you're going to see is that there will be more pressure, of course, from the US side for countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East, to abandon Chinese technology, but that is really hard. The transition cost is almost prohibitive. The political struggle in terms of what China might do to retaliate from a trade perspective, from an investment perspective. If you look at what happened with Australia these days, China has this playbook of how to commercially retaliate or to punish, its investment and trade partners if politically they sort of embarrass China's position globally. So I think there is a choice that many countries will have to eventually make. And I really don't see, the global tech community able to bridge these two very different ecosystems, i.e. the sovereign-driven and the free flow model. So before, I guess, we all become smarter and all become more sort of future-minded, I think, countries will have to pick a side. And that might be inevitable, at least in the short term. And if you look at Europe, it's now, European policy is often 12 to 18 month lag behind US policy. So I think there will be a very heated debate within Europe, not for, picking the Chinese or the American side, but really picking the side of sovereignty-driven data and technology and toward a global free flow of data. And I think the same debate, the same choice will have to be made by the Gulf countries as well. Are the data that are created by Saudi companies with the data of Saudi citizens going to remain in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or are they something that can exist in a global cloud? So that is sort of my assessment, right? There is a tech cold war, and countries will have to pick a side. It's not a sort of a happy conclusion, but I think I'm a bit pessimistic in this regard because technology is very divisive and it is very polarizing, and I don't see really at least the global community capable of coming together and really have a civilized discussion about how to converge the two trends instead of diverge.
Now, I think I'm actually of a very similar opinion about the segmentalization of the globe, technologically speaking. And in some ways, one could argue what's happening is that a lot of global actors are in some ways emulating China and its own approach to cyberspace, whether willingly or not. Like when you mentioned the example of Facebook's lobbying against TikTok, it's ironic that we've gotten to this point when it was Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, had met with the head of cyber security committee in China several times. Yeah. He went to the Washington dinner, the White House dinner with Xi, and asked him to name his daughter. He was displaying, Xi's governing China books in the headquarters. Yeah.
So, and the guy who set it up is now in jail. So,
yeah, but in some ways it's coming full circle, right? The inability to penetrate the Chinese market is therefore pushing a lot of these actors that one would assume would be big promoters of this flat surfaced economic model for the global economy, are now actually calling for a much more regulated and segmentalized technological arena. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, if we expand on Silicon Valley a little bit, like Facebook and Uber and all these other Silicon Valley giants, what they're trying to do, just a few years ago, they still had this hope, or rather, naivete, that they can still replicate their model in China, only to realize that they're going to hit a brick wall. We work with Chinese companies actually that rely quite heavily on Facebook and Google for their advertising platforms. I mean, even TikTok, Facebook's #1 rival globally, is also Facebook's probably #1 client, right? TikTok spent really hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising on Facebook and on Google. So they're trying to drive away users. So it's really something that I think for both countries, they had this brief moment, maybe a couple of years, they thought that, okay, we can replicate our model, we can become a global company, but very soon they got a wake-up call from politics, and they got a wake-up call from reality that this is probably not going to happen. And if they really try to push for it, it's only going to backfire. I think both countries are now come to this realization. Maybe Tesla is the only exception. They still make cars in Shanghai, but again, it's Elon Musk, so we don't want to comment too much on what he's doing.
Maybe he will save us. I don't
know.
Well, I mean, actually, it's good that we sort of went down to Tesla. This actually brings us sort of to the last question, although it focuses more on China, is could you discuss a bit how the private sector in China has been shaped and impacted by sort of the evolution of this technology policies and sort of the broader Sino-American competition? I mean, you sort of mentioned here and there the political loyalty requirements and whatnot, but sort of if you can talk a bit about the broader picture, that would be great.
Sure. So for the private sector in China, I think there are a few things that I want to touch on. The first is, what does this whole state-led technology development policy mean for China's technology companies? The state or the policy makers are a bit late to the game in terms of their desire to drive the growth of Chinese technology companies. And one example I'll give you is the exponential growth of China's local government guiding funds. So this is something that's really unheard of really in most countries. Essentially, this is the government becoming a limited partner or becoming an investor to a venture capital or to a private equity company, right? And the government, by giving a private equity or venture capital firm money, they have a bunch of requirements for, where the portfolio companies, which is basically the tech firms that the VC would invest in, where they should be located, what sectors they should be in. So this is sort of Chinese government's way of encouraging more private sector innovation without directly creating a bunch of SOEs, so state-owned enterprises. Right? So they're trying to use capital as leverage, and they're trying to use VCs as an intermediary vehicle to accomplish innovation. But this has created a problem for what incentivizes innovation and for what incentivizes technology. So if you go to, I was actually in one of these competitions. It's like a pitch competition. That's held by the Shanghai government. So Shanghai, of course, put a lot of money behind technology companies and behind VC firms, and they organized through the VC companies a tech competition or a pitch competition for startups. And if you read into the rules and it's like the award mechanism, it's as long as you can sort of get closer to what the government wants, right? In this case, it's healthcare or AI-driven medical research. So as long as you can sort of make a pitch or trying to align yourselves with the government, you would get, this is even pre-revenue. So your company is not really making any money. It's a pitch competition. It's a PowerPoint competition, basically. And then you would get government backing in the amount of, I think back then was 250,000 to 300,000 RMB, which in US dollars is around $50,000 to $70,000, right? So think about that multiplied by hundreds or even thousands of cities doing the same. What does it do to the private sector is that you are again creating a lot of bubble. You're creating a lot of sort of government-driven experiments that will probably fail. And in this sort of ecosystem, if you look at some of the larger players, they're also trying to do a similar thing by leveraging government resources, because the government is so omnipresent, because the government is so like in the driving seat of a lot of these technology policies and incentive mechanisms. You have companies that are relying not really on innovation, but on real estate. When Steve Jobs died, I remember there was a debate within Chinese tech space and within the Chinese startup world, why China had never produced a Steve Jobs, right? Why there was no sort of leading global innovator that came out of the Chinese internet or technology community. And one answer, jokingly, was that if somebody had that kind of money, they wouldn't reinvest in R&D, they would invest in real estate. It's going to yield so much more return, right? And that's, I think, only half, joke and half reality. If you look at the way governments, local governments support technology, a lot of times it's through infrastructure, right? It's through, we're giving you free lease, right? We're giving you office space, right? As a new startup. And as a startup founder, the financially sort of rewarding way for leveraging this resource is not to really leverage the free rent, is to lease the free company to another startup and become an incubator, right? So that has happened a lot in China's private sector. So again, going back to the high level argument, I think China's state-led development policy for technology, of course, is going to motivate the state-led champions. But in the same time, it is also going to create a lot of waste at the local level. And how much really can this model compete with the private sector driven model in the US, which I still believe is much more efficient and innovative when it comes to technology, because they move faster and you can't really, there are basically less temptations to invest elsewhere and to become eventually a real estate company or to become a landlord. So the perception of just how strong, China's innovation or technology force is, and the reality, there still might be a gap. Because if you look at the U.S. argument, okay, China has all these state-led development models, creating state champions, government subsidizing a lot of companies. So this is, the argument is that this is creating an unfair sort of competitive advantage for Chinese firms, and it's going to undermine American companies. But in reality, how is that actually going to work out? For me, based on what I've seen on the ground, there is still a lot of catch-up that China has to do. And there is this, there's going to be a lot of waste within the state-owned sector, and there's going to be a lot of also waste in the private sector if you follow this approach. And again, with China's sort of drive toward asking private companies to be more politically aligned with the party, how is that going to shape the mentality of Chinese companies, private companies? I think there is this almost consensus that you sort of have to conform and you have to sort of have a clear political mind in order to be successful in China. But if you look at the flow of capital, if you look at money, when private companies become successful, many of them still do choose to invest overseas, to still choose to diversify. So I think that in itself is also proof that this model may or may not really be sustainable in the long term. So yeah, I guess that's my a bit winded assessment of the Chinese private sector under this whole centrally driven technology policy. A lot of waste still, and it might not be as strong or as competitive as the foreign as the U.S. at least may perceive.
Yeah, I can see that. Although, just to sort of play devil's advocate, one could argue that also sort of relegating too much faith in market forces will often leave you with a society and an economy in shambles, as is the case. There isn't that much of a political will to try and address it in any sustainable way. Like you could argue, yes, inequalities are extremely high in China, and there's very serious inefficiencies and problems, but it's part of the elite discourse. And there are efforts, however inefficient, to try and restructure society in such ways. So that could also be applicable, I guess, to the technology sphere, one could argue, in sense that you have a political vision of where technology should go.
Right. And even, I agree with that entirely. And even in the phenomenon that I described in terms of, the waste that's happening in the private sector, in all these government grants and subsidies, they did create jobs. They did, you can argue that maybe all these, $50,000, $60,000 grants, they didn't create the next Facebook, but they did create jobs, and they did benefit a lot of the young people who aspire to start a company. And it would be a good way to alleviate the employment pressure that China is facing. China is graduating an unprecedented number of college graduates this year. So, how do you really create the jobs for them? So I think that's, of course, one of the main driving forces behind the mass innovation, the mass entrepreneurship campaign that Li Keqiang championed a few years ago. And they're now bringing that idea up again, in face of a potential economic downturn after COVID. So the social welfare and the jobs aspect is definitely there. And for this vision of technology, that it should be safe, and the government could be a judge in terms of preventing technology to become too polarizing within the society. I think there is a role that the government can play, and it's a positive role that it can play.
Thanks, Sean. I think now we'll open the rest of the time, which is roughly 25 minutes, for any questions or comments from wider audience. People can type up their questions in the Q&A box, or potentially use the raise hand function, and we can give you the option of voicing your question or comment. But I ask that you introduce yourself and keep the question or comment brief to give an opportunity for the rest of the audience to pose questions. Okay. In the meantime, I think we already have one question that comes from Professor Amido Sani. He asks, the Sino-American relationship and interaction has implications beyond economic and security concerns in Asia and the Middle East. What inbuilt mechanisms are there to assure Asian and African countries that they won't be victims of Sino-American cyber war? I mean, potentially, what inbuilt mechanisms are there to assure that Asian and African countries, that they won't be victims of Sino-American cyber war? I guess potentially also just how could these states prepare and insulate themselves from the worst ramifications of sort of Sino-American competition in the technology sphere?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's a great question. The short answer is there really is no mechanism, at least for now, to prevent other countries, especially in Asia and Africa, to become quote unquote victims of China-America competition. But again, it depends on what kind of of cyber conflict are we talking about? If it's a competition of different models or different path, leveraging the technology of different companies, then I think probably Asian and African countries are most vulnerable to the inefficiencies that's going to be created by, on the one hand, you do have affordable and dependable Chinese technology that you can use. And then on the other hand, you're going to have to face political pressure from the US. But if you're talking about something that's much more intense in terms of like a cyber warfare between China and the US, right now, that's still something that's even being discussed between Chinese and American policy makers, how to set the boundaries. What are some of the no-go zones, off-limit cyber weapons that should not be deployed? So there is really, I think we're still at the dawn of this whole conversation, and there really is no mechanism that can prevent the spillover effect. Ultimately, it's going to depend on the China and the US drawing the lines of off-limit use of data. For example, because AI can be quite damaging and blind. If you're trying to say, for example, in the weapon space, AI algorithms can identify civilians, let's say a woman carrying her child. So the AI algorithm, an autonomous weapon, can identify this image and with, let's say, a soldier holding a rifle. But in the cyberspace, how much algorithm or how much the cyber attackers can distinguish between civilian and military targets, that is something that, from what I know, the militaries of both countries are still grappling with. There are no sort of clear shared definition of off-limit use. Another example in hardware is drones. China is the world's largest maker of commercial drones, the ones you use to take photos and to take aerial shots. But drones are also being widely used in conflict zones, and they can be easily weaponized. So how do you define the boundaries of commercial use and military use of these sort of what we call dual use devices? That has not even been fully discussed and agreed upon by China and the US. So the short answer is that there are still a lot of things that China and the US have to work out. And really, we don't know what are the implications for other countries, and let alone how to prevent them from happening.
The next question comes from Ahmed Al-Qarrout. Will the Huawei ban affect GCC countries?
It will, because I think GCC countries are, Huawei has been traditionally doing quite well in GCC. In terms of their carrier business and their handheld device business. So I think one of the immediate implication is the availability of Huawei consumer devices, because a lot of the bans in terms of Google's Android ban, in terms of the chips that Huawei's consumer devices are depending on, that's something that you'll feel the most immediate impact. For the carrier business, Huawei relies a bit less on American technology, and even if there is a ban, Huawei still has a pretty good stockpile of chips that's used on these 5G carrier, not even 5G, but 4G carrier stations. So it's the impact in the short term is less. And also, Huawei can probably, because for carrier business, they don't really have to focus on how small they make the chips to be. So they can potentially still substitute their own chips with alternatives. It's going to be more costly. So for Huawei, that's not good news. But for their carrier business, for their clients in the countries, they're probably in the short term, they will be okay. But again, the effect will be felt, I think, in the medium term when Huawei, depending on whether Huawei can get out of this saga. And to us, really, like the only possibility is for China and the US to have a top-level agreement to let the same way they got ZTE out of trouble by paying a fine. For Huawei to get out of this, really, that's the only option for President Xi and either Trump or Biden after November to have a summit and then to agree that, okay, Huawei is off the hook. Otherwise, I don't see another solution to this.
Yeah, I think you're right. It'll probably be a political solution when it comes to Huawei. The next question comes from Iram Ashraf, and she wanted to know the implications of China's fiber optic Silk Road for countries stuck between the US and China's worsening relations, particularly countries such as Pakistan. In fact, maybe you could talk a bit about the digital Silk Road. I mean, this would be a great opportunity to.
Yeah, so this again shows China's evolving thinking around technology, right? And there is a lot of criticism for Belt and Road, which relies heavily on traditional infrastructure, on brick and mortar. So China has been advocating for the digital Silk Road and the fiber optic, like building basically digital infrastructure instead of brick and mortar, instead of stadiums and dams and buildings. So I think for countries like Pakistan, China has seen, is not really super worried about the US. And I think that might be a mistake that they're making, because China has this over optimism for how political ties can be sustainable and can overcome some of these new challenges that are faced by China's traditional allies, like Pakistan. So I think in Beijing, at least, there is a bit of underestimation for just how risky it is and how fragile China's position is in these countries. And I think this question in itself is evidence that some countries do feel stuck between China and the US. They have to pick a side, but for Chinese, at least for the foreign ministry, I don't think there is a clear understanding of just how, I guess, risky the situation might be. And that would again translate to some of the industry policy and development policy along the way. I think one of the examples is Myanmar. And again, this is not digital infrastructure, but still traditional infrastructure. But China always felt that Myanmar is in almost China's pocket when they started to, build dams and all kinds of hydro infrastructure in Myanmar, but didn't realize the grassroots mobilization and didn't really have the experience of dealing with the NGOs on the ground that are more prone to, let's say, Western influence, quote unquote. So China, again, just blamed the US for US influence. But the reality is that there was an underestimation of how countries and how private stakeholders are feeling toward Chinese infrastructure. And I think the same is happening in the digital front as well. And we might start to see cases like the Myanmar case emerge in the digital space as well.
Interesting. I encourage the audience, we still have a few more minutes, if they have any further questions that they would like to pose, either in the Q&A box or by raising the hand function. We still have some time. There's a question from Zahaq Tanvir. Because of China's alliance with Pakistan and its deteriorating relations with India, will Chinese technology make Pakistan outdo India's popular IT industry? We're moving into the South Asian sphere in the conversation.
Well, first, I'm not an expert in China-India relationship and also China-Pakistan for that matter, but I think, in terms of India's IT industry, I don't see how, China could really overtake that, or for China to, work with Pakistan to overtake or to outcompete India's IT industry, because, well, first of all, China has a quite similar IT industry with India, and that is a lot of available, relatively lower cost coders. But China's disadvantage is language. You can have Indian developers working really globally for global companies, but for Chinese developers, you see them in Silicon Valley, you see them occasionally in Europe, but most of them are still developing, they're still coding for Chinese internet companies in China, for Chinese IT companies in China. So I don't see how, China-Pakistan alliance or relationship having an impact on India's IT sector, because Pakistan in itself also has a strong IT sector. So I don't see that as a clear. I just don't see a clear linkage between the two. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one day China's developers will be able to compete with Indian developers globally. But so far it's still and we work in technology. I mean I see the sort of divide, and then the sheer advantage of India's developer force globally, and I don't think China can really compete with that on a global stage in the short term.
This leaves us with a lot of food for thought. It'll be interesting to see how things evolve over the next few decades.
Indeed.
I think, we can sort of end the session here. I'd like to reiterate my thanks on the behalf of the King Faisal Center for you honoring with us with this great lecture, and very informative and enriching. And I believe the audience shares the same sentiment. I just wanted to leave everyone with a few notes. Please do visit the King Faisal Center website and check the Asia Studies Unit's page. We have a lot of publications that routinely come out. And also we will be continuing this series on a monthly basis. And hopefully we will be engaging with you further, Sean, in the near future and the long term. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, it's our pleasure. Please do also follow us on the social media handles and contact us through that email. Well,
great. Thank you for having me.
Have a good day.
Thanks everyone
good
for joining.
morning and good evening. Yeah.
Ma salama.
Ma salama.